大家早哈，我今天就先作为一个引言人的工作是，要帮大家为今天我们从主专题到下午2场的座谈做有点像懒人包的介绍啊。OK， 那因为我们会把这个展览跟我们所有的工作，包括说日后会出版的画册，当作是一个历史书写的形态，而不会只是一个活动。好，所以我们其实经过很多时间在讨论这个展览到论坛的时候，其实我们会把它当成是一个动态的现场，意思就是说，我们这一次把论坛的那个演讲者，包括FRODON先生跟下午7位，包括主持人跟主讲者呢，他们都是怎么样去见证杨德昌的创作。杨德昌的工作跟杨德昌很重要的电影精神的影响然后所以呢，我等一下会透过一个很简单的 PPT 跟大家讲说，我们今天可能会触及到这些面向，那也包括跟大家讲一下，我们今天为什么会邀请以下这几位重要的主讲者来到现场跟大家交流。好。这张图就是我想先从这个图像开始因为这个图是杨德昌在1970年代的时候，当他念完了硕班然后他在1970年代初呢就决定去南加大学习电影的那个学期所拍到的一张照片所以你可以看到我们把这个照片当成是展览的某一个展件的主视觉，就是说他已经开始梦想要当导演当然很快，因为他不喜欢在那个电影研究所的整个好莱坞或是的这种创作的气氛，后来当然就辍学了嘛。那1980到81年他就回来台湾，就先在台湾电视公司那大家可以在我们的城市探索者这个展件里面看到杨德昌这个目前留下来非常非常少的有关扶贫的这个材料那这个故事当然就是非常非常杨德昌的典型，就是说这个女主角她梦想的从9份离开，然后要到台北去打拼嘛。当然后来的片子是她失望的或幻灭的回到台北那这个目前扶贫的这个材料，因为它其实只剩下2张的工作照跟一本当时台视留下的电视剧本大家可以去现场看看。那这张大概就是鼎鼎大名的光阴的故事的开镜照所以当天在开镜的时候呢，是杨德昌第一个人先祭拜大家可以看到右边是张毅先生所以当然还有另外2位柯一正跟陶德生，他们在另外境外的画面外面所以这是一个非常非常重要的时刻，因为1983年当光阴故事拍完之后呢，他们是在新电影是基本上是第一部到了国外的影展，就是伦敦影展然后当然就获得很多的认同，包括说认识了当年的汤尼雷恩然后还有后续台湾新电影跟伦敦这些国际友人的关系。那到了1983年的时候，杨德昌就当然就拍了他第一部非常受到票房肯定的作品，叫《海滩的一天》大家也知道说从文献里面他如何和这些中影的传统的摄影师吵架，然后为了要引进杜可风等等的这些非常非常重要的事迹当然这作品证明他后来的选择是对的。那1985年1985年青梅竹马，当然就是这张照片我只给大家看，因为这也是我们重要的展品之一，是重要的一个设计师刘开先生他跟杨德昌的合作所以右上角也有很多相关的剧照。那我为什么放这张照片是等一下我们可以提到下午的论坛，我们邀请了阮凤仪导演来然后对我来讲，我觉得杨德昌在1980年代所开启的有关美国跟台湾之间的这种移民的命题呢，其实到了30年后也延续到新的一代的导演上面去所以这个问题也是我们下午可以去讨论的问题。那1986年在新电影结束的前一年呢，杨德昌导演拍摄了《恐怖分子》非常非常重要的一部作品，不管是视觉也好，还有说命题也好，那当年也在金马奖跟国际上面获得很大的认同嘛。那这张照片是刘正祥老师当年在电影现场的时候所拍下的，留下非常非常多重要的剧本那我现在也可以讲一个可能跟展览有关系的一个小小的故事，是因为大家记得在恐怖分子里面有一张蜀安的特写嘛，对不对那张照片呢，刘老师当年把它放大之后，就裁切了66张的照片就给了剧组去拍摄嘛。那我们最近就是这几个月呢，因为想要重置那张 照片就跟刘老师说，那张底片可不可以给我们用？然后我们想要重置它，结果呢，他其实那张底片也找不到了。就是说在电影史上，刘老师所拍的那张照片已经遗失了，所以我们其实就从目前数位版的恐怖分子截取出来那个画面，再重新的用倒带的方式把那个图像复制出来。所以这是一个很有趣的一个方式，可以跟大家讲一下我们如何重写电影史的一个概念。那1986年11月6号，新电影学院写完之后呢，1987年1月他们公布在各大报纸嘛，那就开启了我们所谓的台湾新电影之后的这个运动。那舒淇老师在现场，他应该很清楚说，1987年之后，他跟杨德昌导演开始讨论有关要改编张爱玲小说《色戒》的这个事情。所以早在2007年李安导演在拍摄《色戒》之前呢，其实杨德昌就已经够想要去改编它。当年他其实把它称之为暗杀啦。那我们在问物里面呢，其实找到一个非常有趣的版本，就是他有写的英文版，而且把时间定在2001年，然后这是他手写所留下来的一些字迹，所以下午也很期待舒淇老师可以谈论相关的这个细节。那1987年的新电影之后开始呢，其实我觉得杨德昌有一个非常非常重要的历程，是他到了国立艺术学院，就是现在的北艺大，受到赖声川导演的邀请呢，到了戏剧学院去担任所谓的艺术教师啊。现在大家已经没有叫，我不知道什么叫艺术教师啊。可是他就去上了一门课，他还留下了课表课表就是礼拜3下午的1点到4点2个小时上电影原理。那我们在做访谈的时候，问了陈以文，问了王维明，问了其他人，所谓的电影原理呢，其实就跟聊天嘛，然后就聊天，然后可是聊天呢，其实很好玩，是他会跟你讲说，比如说你想象一下这个火柴盒，这个香烟盒打开，它怎么组织成一个结构，然后从这个结构去思考说电影的等等的构成所以其实是透过这方式去刺激他们的想法。那更关键的地方是说，因为杨导在北艺大，就现在的北艺大，召集了非常多的演员嘛，跟工作团队，包括我刚刚讲的陈以文、王文明跟陈湘琪，所以1990年前后，他们开拍了《牯岭街少年杀人事件》的时候呢，这群工作人员就进入的团队，就影响了后来台湾新电影非常台湾电影很关键的一些发展那陈湘琪老师呢，大家在里面是他第一部作品嘛，很小的角色，演一个未婚妻。可是大家如果去看《牯岭街》的顺场表的时候，你会发现说，其实他还演一个叫什么卖票小姐之类的，所以他其实有担任非常非常各种角色，每个演员很复杂，所以大家可以从里面去重构那个台湾电影史的一些的痕迹。那1992年开始之后呢，其实杨导有一个目前我觉得在台湾电影史或后来电影史从来都没有讨论过问题，就是杨导跟剧场的关系。我也觉得是这一次在展览里面，我觉得是可以把这些材料提供出来呢，让大家能够去做研究跟重新思考杨德昌跟剧场的关系的一个非常非常重要的拼图那92年的时候，陈湘琪跟王维明他们当然就改编了一个日本漫画叫做《灵域》嘛。那这里面就是讲说就是一个尸体在客厅里面他们怎么解决。所以这个作品是非常非常关键的，去开启了杨德昌对于戏剧的想象。那1993年的另外隔年呢，他们就做了一个剧场作品，叫做《成长季节》。成长季节有4个演员，那你们现在看到就是陈湘琪跟陈以文。所以陈湘琪跟陈以文其实很早以前就已经合作过了，早在千祥导演的作品之前然后这个作品很关键的地方是说，它其实作为独立时代的一个前身当天他们表演的时候，其实就是独立时代的开镜的记者会那这是昨天姚瑞忠跟昨天晚上我们在中心看开幕片的时候，杨导在拍幕现场的这个拍摄现场的画面嘛然后这也是独立时代陈以文在里面所演的一个公务员的角色所以我的意思说，今天下午我们在听陈以文跟陈湘琪的时候，就可以从这脉络里面去切入，还包括说陈湘琪后来在独立时代担任女主角那我现在就进入到我们为什么会请FRODON老师这是我们在档案里面看到一个非常非常关键的素材这是FRODON先生Jean-Michel FRODON 1994年10月27号他就写信给杨导，因为他们电影笔记呢要做一个电影100年的专题那所谓的电影100年呢，当年FRODON先生他们选择的是要写11月6号台湾新电影宣言的那个晚上所发生的事情。 所以他就写信给杨导说，可不可以提供给我中文的材料，然后我们可以把它翻译成外文，然后我可以写这个文章啊。然后这是杨导的回应，他说没问题啊，然后我想办法找一些英文素材给你，然后你在法国可以找这个人，他也帮助你翻译啊。当然后来台湾新电影的英文翻译其实很晚才出现了，大概是30年以后才有正式的版本。然后他就跟他讲说，其实那天我给你写信的时候不是1987年，是1986年，因为11月6号是我的生日啊，等等等等等。好，所以这是2个很重要的档案，我们并没有展示出来，可是因为FRODON在我小时候现场给他看一下，其实我们都知道他们在聊什么，只是我不跟大家讲。好，然后就是我刚刚说的电影笔记在1995年做了一个非常非常重要的100年电影史的专题哦，所以他就选择了电影史上100天最重要的事件，然后台湾新电影就在那一个10月6号的1986年晚上就进入到电影史的一天。好，那1-2年后呢，台湾的远流出版社出了一本书，叫做《电光幻影100年》，就是这本，好，大家可以找来看看。过了许多年之后，2010年，法国电影馆做了完整的杨德昌电影回顾啊，从11月8号到10月20号，2010年，也在那个时候呢，FRODON先生出版了法语世界上面，我觉得比起英文跟中文都来得更完整的一本评论集啦。啊，就说他自己主编，他也收集了杨导在《世界报》所写的文章啊，新书写，还有包括他也收集了贾樟柯、侯孝贤等等。人对杨导的一些思考啊，然后当然还有更重要的是说FRODON先生在里面用一个历史的方式，从80年代一直写到台湾，写到后面动画的部分，我觉得是非常非常完整的。那很快呢，这本书也在10年前也翻成中文嘛，但因为这2天FRODON先生问我说他想看一下中文本长什么样，后来我发现我本来想说买一本送给他，但我昨天去书店找的时候，还有上 Internet， 其实已经绝版了。所以再想办法以后看有没有2手的可以再送给他。那今天的最后一个论坛呢，因为我们要谈的是杨德昌的遗赠嘛，那我们分别会请到陈俊霖导演，因为陈俊霖导演跟杨德昌基本上是杨德昌从小看他长大，后来也问他说要不要去念电影的一个非常非常重要的青年导演嘛。所以在2010年呢，陈俊霖拍了一部片子叫《一夜台北》，哈，就是职业的夜。那一夜台北当然就讲说这个男生他想要去巴黎啊，然后学法文啊，然后追求他女朋友啊，所以这作品对我来讲，我也想问说，陈俊霖怎么样去重新的思考台北跟国外这些城市的关系，怎么跟杨导的作品产生对话？然后另外一个重要的在我们看很重要的一个线索是阮凤仪导演在2020年拍的《美国女孩》啊，《美国女孩》刚好正相反，就是像我刚刚说的，青梅竹马是梦想着从台北去美国，可是他们是从美国回到台北啊，因为妈妈生病了啊，所以这里面就回到了一个台北跟美国之间，我觉得很有趣的一个隔代的世代的对话。然后最后呢，Hamaguchi-san，就是滨口龙介先生，这张照片是我在去年的《镜周刊》看到的一个照片嘛，因为那个实际是2022年年底的东京影展啊，东京影展刚好就是放映了杨德昌的《独立时代》，所以滨口龙介先生呢就在现场说他非常非常喜欢杨德昌，也就是因为这新闻呢，我们看到之后我们觉得很兴奋，就决定要找Hamaguchi-san来台北，结果他就答应了，啊，这件事情就成了啊，所以大家就可以听听看下午呢如何导演能够回应这个问题啊。以上是我的引介，好，那我接下去跟大家讲一下FRODON先生非常非常很快的对他的一个介绍，因为他的著作非常多啊，大家可以看大会准备的导册上面就可以知道他非常多的著作，我没有办法一一的跟大家讲，但我选择了其中的2-3本非常非常关键哈，因为FRODON先生其实是一个非常非常资深的记者，先在《世界报》，后来是法国电影笔记非常非常重要的主编。因为我们都知道说法国电影笔记跟台湾电影关系非常深刻嘛。早在80年代83、84年的时候，当阿萨尔斯还是电影笔记的记者的时候，他们就到了香港跟台北来访问了当时在刚崛起的新电影导演。后来当然就在法国笔记做了很完整的所谓的中国电影的介绍哦。那隔了许多年之后，当侯导已经成为国际名导的时候呢，FRODON作为主编，他就跟非常非常多电影笔记的评论家，他们一起合写了这本侯孝贤的专书，在1999年出版啊。那很快的，在2000年的时候就出现了 中文版，好，那当然就是很多的留法的同伴们他们一起翻译的一本书，好，然后这本书当然也目前已经绝版了，好，但是它是非常非常重要的一个素材，怎么样提供法语世界跟所谓的欧洲世界对于侯导的思考。那像我刚刚说，这本书在2010年出版嘛，因为是法国电影笔记回顾展的关系，所以这本书是目前法语世界最完整，甚至是国际上我觉得对于侯导最完整的一本评论集。那很快的呢，在这本书也在过多年之后就出版，好，所以这是FRODON老师的这本书的中文翻译。那目前其实已经找不到这本书了，好，然后这本书大家可以找来看，因为我觉得是做得非常非常好的。那另外FRODON老师当然不只是对台湾电影很熟悉啦，他对华语电影更加熟悉，比如贾樟柯啊等等，也是在他的书写的脉络里面啊。然后这是简体字版的贾樟柯事件。那最后呢，FRODON老师他应该不会是第一次来到台北，好，虽然说他可能是第一次来到台北市立美术馆，但在3年前呢，Keynote Speaker 的台北双年展的时候，叫你我不在同一个星球上呢，FRODON先生和加拿大的拉莎沙迪跟 Collective 这个组织呢，他们就做了一个作品叫做跨物种影像交汇啊，在我们目前展一的那个现场里面。所以如果当时大家有在现场的话，可以发现说，其实很多长得很像蜘蛛的装置，然后每个荧幕上面摆设的17、8个影像片段，其中包括侯孝贤的《聂隐娘》，其中包括蔡明亮的《河流》跟阿皮小蹦的。热带幻梦等等等等，好，然后去构成所谓的在那个星球跟后人类、跟后自然等等的命题。那我就从这里开始呢，希望请FRODON先生上台，然后回到这个台北现场给大家做专题演讲。以上是我引介，谢谢。
Hello everyone. I'm a bit moved. This is too much you've been saying about me. I'm very happy and grateful to be here. Where is this? First of all, I would like to salute this magnificent event, which is finally giving Edward Young back his rightful place in his own country. This eminent play celebrated by the major exhibition and this symposium organized by Taipei Fine Art Museum and the Taiwan Film and Audiovisual Institute with the invaluable help and initiative of Kylie Peng. But it is also celebrated by the restoration of his films and the effort to circulate them. And this, the whole of it, does justice to someone who was a visionary artist and intellectual figure in more ways than one. As the exhibition designed by Wang Junjie and Song-Yong so aptly demonstrates, it is both the coherence and the diversity of Edward Young's contributions that should be celebrated. It therefore seems important to me to situate Edward Young, who he was and what he did, within several histories, at the crossroads of several trajectories. And I would like to insist here on the word history. We have seen in the exhibition and heard yesterday about the multiple activities and talents of Edward Young. And this is totally appropriate, and we've been talking a lot, we heard a lot about interdisciplinarity, which is such an important aspect. But this is not only about the fact that Edward was this and that, but that he was part of dynamics, of ongoing stories, which to a large extent began before him and went on after him, but in which he took part in very significant way at the crossing point of these different long-term histories, and this is what I will try to address today. Among these histories, Edward Yang obviously belonged to the history of Taiwanese cinema. He occupies an eminent and, it seems to me, unique place in it. This history, that of Taiwanese cinema, is singularly fertile and at the same time rather complex to describe and understand. I'm not able, I wouldn't be able, and I wouldn't try to cover it at large, but try to mention some element of the part of this history to which Edward Yang relates with. What took place in the early 80s and later came to be known as the New Taiwanese Cinema, NTC, as a phenomenon, is a phenomenon that is both part of a long international tradition, that of the so-called new waves, and with highly original characteristic. The new wave phenomenon, which can also be called the modern revolutions in cinema, occurred almost everywhere in the world from the second half of the 1950s onward, when cinema had already been existing for more than half a century. As we all know, the term Nouvelle Vague, new wave, originated in France, where it was used to describe this movement embodied by François Truffaut's 400 Blows, Alain Resnais, Hiroshima, My Love, Agnès Varda, Cléo, Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless, and films by Eric Romer, Jacques Rivette, Chris Marker, and others. But even if it was a French label that was used all over the world, the phenomenon didn't start in France. It appeared in Great Britain, in Brazil, in Italy, with, among others, Antonioni, we've been talking about and will talk about again. And in the years that followed, it was to be found almost everywhere in Europe, both Eastern and Western Europe, in the United States and Japan, and it also reached the rest of the world, but later. In the world of Chinese culture, it emerged almost simultaneously in the early 80s with Taipei as one of the main centers. It was indeed a collective movement, as signaled by the two omnibus films that marked its public appearance and recognition, In Our Time and The Sandwich Man, whose credits included the names of 7 young directors, themselves surrounded by screenwriters, producers, critics, who gave this generational movement its full reality. But also, it is fair to say that within this movement, 2 names stand out, those of Hu Xiaoxian and Edward Yang, which would become figures of unparalleled importance in the years to come. This is not the place to go into details on this fascinating story, but it is important to underline Edward Yang's contribution to this historical context. Among the Taiwanese newcomers of this time, he was the man who studied in the United States, who studied and then practiced the still nascent field of computer science, who experienced, and this is important, the American counterculture of the 60s and the 70s, and also, this is important too, the European-style cinephilia. When back in Taiwan, he was not only a member of the group that wanted to change cinema. His home, as he called it, old Japanese-style house on Sinan Street, where he would say there was not even a lock since there was nothing to steal, became the headquarters of this movement. And then he would gather later on many of those who took part in this movement, including inside his film. And there, in this house, he was the one who introduced the others to the world's cinematic modernities and a relationship to the world imbued with the spirit of that era as it blew around the globe in the 60s and the 70s. But not much at the time in this island, still under the martial law. And it was here that the famous manifesto of November 6, 1986, and it has been shown again through this mail, we saw, which was co-signed by 54 personalities involved in the avant-garde movement, was discussed and drafted. But contrary to the usual practice of a manifesto, which is supposedly to be the launching of a movement, this one could be seen as marking the end rather than the beginning of the new Taiwanese cinema, or at least the end of its collective dynamic. As a central figure in the emergence of a new generation and a new idea of cinema in Taiwan, Edward Yang is also part of a broader movement concerning the emergence of Chinese culture cinemas worldwide. He is one of the main representatives of this phenomenon, embodied in Taiwan primarily by himself and Hu Xiaoshen, as we've already said, but also by the directors of the so-called fifth generation, like Chen Kaige, Zhang Yimou, and Tian Juanchuan, mainly, and others, of course, in mainland China, and a modern surge in Hong Kong, two of whom leading figures were An Hoi and Tsui Hark, and whose most famous ambassador worldwide was shortly afterwards Wong Kar-wai. As different as they may be, and they were, altogether, these filmmakers suddenly massively introduced in the international scene Chinese ways to tell a story, to design a character, to take advantage of a long and rich cultural background. But if he is one of Taiwan's leading directors and one of the China world's great directors, he is also one of the greatest directors in the history of cinema in general, in the history of cinema worldwide. And this is, for instance, why Martin Scorsese would immediately support the preservation of his work, especially Brighter Summer Day, through the World Film Foundation. The recent ranking of two of his films, Yi and A Brighter Summer Day, among the 100 best films of all time by a college of 1,639 critics, programmers, curators, archivists, and academics, is the most authoritative international ranking in this field. That of the Sight and Sound magazine bears witness to this. And many filmmakers from successive generations marvel at discovering his cinema. Having had the privilege of writing a book about Edward Yang, which was shown before, it's here if somebody wants to have a look at it. I also was approached by many young people, including young directors, who wanted to learn more about him or just to express their admiration. But Edward Yang, his work, and more broadly, his artistic approach, are also part of the history of the evolution of languages. His films are personal compositions, incorporating elements from Chinese culture and Taiwanese history, as well as echoes of the great modern exploration of international cinema, with traceable influences for many directors, among whom one should quote Werner Herzog, of course, which has been extensively documented, and Michelangelo Antonioni. I would add a footnote here, echoing something that was said yesterday, that Edward Yang dismissed later on to have any relation with Antonioni. We discussed this, Edward and myself, at the time, because he was fed up that there were too much references to L'Avventura made for that day on the beach, which was, he felt like too intrusive regarding his work, but of course he knew very well Antonioni's work and had a lot of attention and feeling about it. So Antonioni reference makes sense, even if it should not be over situated regarding all his work. As was also several times mentioned yesterday and is very well documented in the exhibition, there are many traces. His work bear traces of completely different aesthetic field, that of manga, with Edward Young's Lost, which Edward Young loved passionately, with his particular taste for the work of Osamu Tezuka. And traces of this can be seen in the drawing he produced, in particular the working paper he used to elaborate the complex scenario for Confucian confusion. Yet his use of drawing is only part of the visual vocabulary he developed that can be related with his attention to comic aesthetic at large. And the wideness of his visual attempt to enlarge and go in different ways. It can be seen, it can translate with his first feature film, That Day on the Beach, which is not only his first feature film, but for which him and his producer and star, Sylvia Chang, against the advice of CMPC Studio and almost everybody in the profession, imposed a rookie cinematographer that had done absolutely nothing as a DOP at the time. Nobody else had Christopher Doyle, who would go on to become a very distinguished director of photography, notably with Wong Kar-wai and with others. In this film, That Day on the Beach already, the use of close-ups and the very strange use of saturated lighting contribute to the originality of this first feature film's visual writing, as does the completely heterodox structure of the screenplay itself. From this point on, the visual vocabulary of his films is constantly refined and expanded, without ever repeating itself. Among the most significant visual and sensory motifs are the use of geometric frames inside the image, in some cases reminiscent of comic book panels. But also in a different level of visual language, the use of darkness and even totally black images, and the considerable work on reflections. Or, and this would be another possible underground influence of manga, the discrepancies between what the image shows and what is on the soundtrack. These visual and audiovisual effects are never gratuitous. They play a part in the dramatic construction of each film with its own unique narrative stakes. But there is yet another dimension to Edward Young's approach, this time related to his training as a computer scientist. In the early 1960s, as a student in the Department of Electrical Engineering at the University of Florida, he chose as his research topic the possibilities of giving computers the means to process Chinese text. I believe this is a very important move that should be acknowledged better than it is. At university, then as an engineer, and then when he becomes a professional engineer, which he was on the West Coast of the United States, he worked on these issues with, as he wrote, the question of understanding how the transition to computers would affect forms of writing that had for millennia been influenced by calligraphy. This is, for me, it is the core of a very deep thinking of building new languages, which translates in hardly easily seen ways of directing, of script writing, of image making in so many ways. Over and above the considerable, strictly technological issues to which he had been linked, there is a constant meditation on the mutations of form and meaning according to the processes used, which is the mark of both a great artist and a great thinker of his art, and also of a thinker of the effects of his art, both political and psychological. This thinking in action, which translated into realizations in the movie field, found a series of significant translations, but which above all prefigured what should have been new developments for the 21st century that was just beginning, had death not struck him far too early. I'm thinking here in particular of the online channel Miluku, which he invented to test new formats and visual languages based on digitally generated image. The very concept of Miluku was an incredible anticipation of what is now our daily life companions. And so on. Online channels as we deal with all the time. This multi-languages research also led to the animated martial art film project inspired by traditional Chinese images, The Wind, to which he devoted much of his later years. It was developed inside the studio he created with his wife, Kylie Peng, with also the collaboration of the Hong Kong action film star Jackie Chan. On another level, the filmmaker's training as a computer engineer can be associated with the way he organizes scenarios that thwart conventional narrative logics, while still managing to retain an understanding of how the story unfolds. When asked about this complex narrative structure, I was asking him, it's an interview I made with him, Edward Young would say, I quote, "The most important thing is to provide the viewer with the necessary information in the right order. And in this case, it's possible to break free from the usual spatial and temporal barriers," unquote. In other words, an optimum management of information comparable to an engineer's approach, especially a computer engineer approach, at the service of a radical artistic project, which can also be seen from the first feature film, with a complex circulation in time, and above all, the main character's choice not to seek to elucidate what seemed to be the film's enigma. In various forms, this approach runs through all his work as a filmmaker, right up to Yi. I insist in calling this film Yi, as I have to say he did, and not a one and a two. And he cared for the original title, which luckily was also the title used in Europe for the release of the film. So right up to Yi, whose title he explained in terms of a system even more minimalist than the 0-1 that underpins computer language. I quote Edward, "Yi means one in Chinese. It is the simplest sign, a horizontal line, and also the first word in the dictionary. I wanted every element in the film to be as simple as possible, even if the assemblies can become very complex. First, I wrote a series of events for each character, and only then I did think about how to link them together." Yet another aspect of this exceptional personality is that, perhaps better than anyone else in cinema at his time, he embodied globalization as the way in which our planet has reconfigured itself over the last 40 years. This is by no means a cinema that has become internationalized through co-productions. Edward Yang shot all his films in Taiwan, with the exception of a few sequences from Ii in Japan, the film having been produced by the Japanese company Pony Canyon. On the contrary, his cinema is remarkably situated, located in Taiwan, in the world and history of this part of the world and this culture. But it is from there that he perceived and translated the extent to which interactions between here and elsewhere were multiplying and merging in a country that was indeed at the forefront of the great mutations of the late 20th century. This is very clear from Taipei's story, and the phenomenon will be explicitly embodied by the presence and maladjustment of the character played by Virginie Ledoyen in Mahjong. And it is, of course, one of the main driving forces behind Yi. In the same vein, but on a different level, his work plays a key role in the ability of the international cinephilia, that is, above all, European and North American cinephilia, to open up to formal and narrative proposals from part of the world that had been underrepresented for so long, and especially from Asia, from the Chinese world, among others. From the so-called Far East from Western point of view, of course. And in this context, the role of festivals and critics was decisive, as was the action of a number of go-betweens who helped Edward Young's films to be taken into consideration. Among them, I'd like to mention the leading French filmmaker Olivier Assayas, who was still a critic at Cahiers du Cinéma when he discovered Edward Young's first feature film, That Day on the Beach, thanks to the embassy of Chen Kuo-fu, whom Assayas met at the Hong Kong Film Festival, a festival that itself played such an important role in making these cinemas visible worldwide. And this is a good opportunity for me also to salute Li Chuk-to, who, with Jacob Wong, played an essential role to open the world to the cinemas from all the region. Olivier and Edward remained close friends until his death. And I remember with emotion the moment when, it was in Kyoto, Edward Young met the actress Virginie Ledoyen, who was accompanying Olivier Assayas for the film in which she was the lead actress, The Cold Water, a meeting that would make the French actress one of the Mahjong main actresses. But we must also salute the late Pierre Hessian, who did so much to make Edward Young's cinema visible, notably through the Cannes Film Festival, and Tony Raines, who was so important in making Young's cinema visible in the English-speaking world. Finally, and sadly, especially after Edward Young's death, Taiwan's cultural services abroad have been very helpful in recognizing his work and keeping his memory alive. I can testify to this, having benefited from it myself when I published my book in coordination with a complete retrospective of his film at the French Cinematheque in 2010. The book was published with the strong support of the Taiwanese Culture Office in Paris, and I am grateful to them. As a film critic, my responsibility is to watch the films, to consider and discuss them one by one. And in this respect, I do perceive each of Edward Young's films as a major proposition, calling for numerous meditations and opportunities to draw inspiration from what it is proposed formally as well as narratively. And this would deserve a lot of talks addressing each film specifically. But this is not the right place to do this today, in the occasion of this major exhibition and the symposium organized thanks to the Taipei Fine Art Museum and the Taiwan Film and Audiovisual Institute. We are trying to measure what his body of work has opened up for us. It's in a more general way, in the sense of his legacy. Over and above the singular issues at stake in each film, it seems to me that it's by inscribing his singular issues at stake in each, by inscribing his personal journey in these 5 historical continuums that I just mentioned, that we can take the measure of what he was and what he passed on to us, being at the same time part of the history of Taiwanese cinema, of Chinese cinema, of modern cinema, of visual languages, including manga and digital history, and of globalization. But to conclude, I'd like to emphasize yet another dimension of Edward Young's work that I believe to be very important, and one that has not been given enough attention so far meaning until 2 days ago, in the sense that it is being paid attention to it extensively, and this is in the exhibition, and for me this is one of the great values of this exhibition. It has to do with the relation to the city, with the urbanistic question. This does not appear only from here and there in the film, but it runs through much of his film work in different forms. I'm talking about the perception and highlighting of urban mutations, thanks to Edward Young's exceptional sensitivity to what was happening in the city of Taipei. He loved this city with a passion, and he also looked at it like a history book. I remember the many times he'd said to me, let's go around the city. And he would tell me the history of the country through its neighborhood while driving around. All his films, but particularly Taipei Story, Terrorizers, Confucian Confusion, Mahjong, and Yi, constitutes a veritable archive of the city's mutations. In itself, it would be remarkable. Very few filmmakers have filmed the city so well, less for their beauty or spectacular sides than as visible, audible, sensitive, formal evidences of social changes. And this relates with something which has been said also already yesterday, but which would deserve more attention, which is how much Edward Young was a political filmmaker, not political necessarily in the sense of addressing openly or classically understood as politic topics, but with the deep notion and feeling that making films was relating with the world as it is, the world as it is, maybe should not be, or the forces at work in the society he belonged to, or maybe I should say the societies, because he was very much aware at the same time to be part of the Taiwanese society and a larger sense of the human communities. He was definitely a Taiwanese filmmaker, and he was also a citizen of the world. And as a citizen of the world, he made the films he did make. So all these dimensions are extensively present. And yeah, this image, I do love this reflection where there is just like It is traffic lights, a very tiny red spot you see in the middle, but it's like the heart of the lonely mother silhouette we hardly see behind the window, and the connection between the human being, fragile human being, and the city outdoor, and the immensity of the echoes is very simple, actually. Image draws is for me is a very good single contraction of many of the strands Edward's cinema was able to rise and to share. This the way he depicted what was happening in the urban landscape in Taipei would be precious in itself. But it so happens that Taipei was, during the last decades of the 20th century, a precursor urban laboratory for the evolutions of the big cities in the developed world at large. It is these transformations which concern the entire planet, or large portions of this planet, that Edward Young films have enabled us to perceive, even if we didn't completely realize it when we watched them at the time. It is only now, and it was said very appropriately yesterday, that rewatching his film now shows how much he was seeing part of it consciously, part of it it's there because of his approach of cinema. He would not necessarily phrase it at the time. It was not possible, but he had this sensitivity that what was going on specifically here in Taipei. It's not even in Taiwan. It's really Taipei on many levels was meaningful. Also in a larger sense that for the city itself or the country itself. These changes concerns the buildings, the public spaces, the traffic lanes, the traffic light, everything that has to do with architecture and urban planning. But not only. This also concerns, above all, individual and collective relationships. Family relationships, work relationships, relationships between lovers, relationships between generations, language, science, food, every aspect of the life. So this is a major issue. It's not only about architecture and building design. This is the ways of life and the shift of the ways of life as it translated into material and visual situation he could witness in this specific city, with some advance regarding other cities. There were very few other cities where it could have happened, but those cities didn't have the filmmaker to testify for it. There was only one place where the encounter between the urban situation and the filmmaking presence of a major director created this reflection on what was happening. The way he, yeah, I missed. This is one more image of the same thing, which wasn't. But the way in which, while being very sensitive to these interactions and the way they were changing, and very aware of them, he recounted them through fiction. This decisive mutation and that they affect everyone's life. They play a decisive role in why the man I am honored to have been able to call my friend remains today a major figure in the art of cinema. Thank you.
谢谢波动先生演讲哦。那我先提第一个问题，那之后我们就把时间开放各位，好不好？好，那我还是想要追问， 就是在他的题目里面提到的先知，英文翻 visionary 嘛，好，那我们昨天晚上大家一起看了《独立时代》，我想再问一下，作为一个法国的学者，他怎么样在看待杨德昌在21世纪他已经不在的这个现在呢？那个先知这个概念到底还有什么样的可能性？
Yeah, what I was trying to underline in this talk is that Edward Young, well, found himself, but also and mostly built himself on different tracks at the same time. His life was based on having been and being not only very open-minded, which he was, and curious of so many things, but able to understand the historicity of various processes and the way they can combine and translate into filmmaking. And it's not that these different fields he related with and he to a certain extent embodied were mixed together. They were fuel each other and make him more sensitive to what was going on in the world at large, because I was surprised each time we meet, we would discuss French politics, we would discuss elections in the US, we would discuss about some rock singer in England or in Germany. But this is not like only eclectic spirit, which he was. This is somebody who knew how to digest what was going on in this world and to make cinema out of it as a way to share. And I was really moved by yesterday at the Cinematheque, at the Film Institute, people on the stage, they acknowledge how much we can see more now than many were able to see at the time about what was happening and what is happening. And this is really for me the one of the strengths of Edward Young's legacy, that we have still a lot to find out about him, about his work, but about our world. Thanks to him, and this is yes what I try to summarize with this Crossroads formula.
我们现在有12分钟，是不是我们就立刻开放给各位？然后请问题简短。好，大家举手就可以把麦克风递给你。来 ，Marcus， 马教授，来。
I think you said Olivier Assayas was the first to write about the Taiwan filmmakers in France. Could you talk about the process in which other people more generally discovered them in France and finally became popular?
Yes, Olivier Assayas together, he was a film critic with another rather famous film critic, Charles Tesson. Together they published what became, at least in France, very famous issue of Cahiers du Cinéma about Hong Kong at the time in the early 80s. And then when they had more or less completed their work in Hong Kong. Olivier meet with, they had a few days left before going back to France. Charles Tesson went to mainland China, and Olivier had met with Chen Kuo-fu, who told him, well, but you know, the most important thing is not happening here in Hong Kong, it's happening in Taipei. And they had not heard anything about that. What? So he goes there. And actually on the same day, the first day he arrives with being a little tired by the travel, he sees in a row that day on the beach and boys from Fenghui. So he kind of drowns into the rising of new Taiwanese cinema in one afternoon and evening, and then meet with both of them, and he would relate. As you may know, Olivier Assayas directed a documentary about Hu Xiaoshen as well, but they are two Edward and Olivier, there are two very open-minded, educated, multicultural spirit which would get along immediately very well. So this was really important. Then it took time. Film festivals played a significant role in France, as elsewhere. I don't want to over-exaggerate what happened in France compared to other countries, but at least in France there is a pretty well-known film festival called Three Continent Festival, which has been a gate for many films from many different parts of the world, from Asia, also from Africa and Latin America. And there, some of the films were already shown, but it took a while to get the first commercial distribution of Edward Young film until Pierre Rissian, who some of you may have known, you remember, who was a very active talent scout, especially in the Asian world, became a strong supporter of Edward's film. He's seen here, he's seen in Hong Kong Festival, and he would advocate to Cannes Film Festival, so films would be invited there. But some of the films were also shown in Locarno, so also shown elsewhere. So I don't want to put France alone in the front row of the Western discoveries of Edward's film, but France was part of it, and we saw actually a shortened version of A Brighter Summer Day that was first commercially released at the time, and Edward was not happy at all with that, and then I was part of those who protested against that, and ultimately the same distributor would release the complete version of the film. So it's always step by step. It's a fight. There are so much harder fights that no one should exaggerate on that. But you have to frail the way each time to make it happen. Yes.
Thank you.
谢谢FRODON教授的演讲哈。我的问题正好是要追问的，就是您刚才最后提到有关于杨导演的作品的一个商业放映的情况，因为他的作品在影展圈绝对是一个常胜军，而且获得很多的艺术上的成就。可是他的影片在台湾，我想我们要面对一个残酷的事实，就是他的青梅竹马在台北只有4天就下片。所以换句话说，他的作品在台湾不见得是有商业上的一种放映的价值。那我不晓得说，在法国经过你们的努力，怎么样的能够让他在商业市场上面能够获得一个一般民众的肯定？谢谢。
Well, there is this so-called cinephilia. This relationship to the art of cinema and the attention. This is one of the reasons why I mentioned the New Wave, Nouvelle Vague label at the beginning. For ages, actually, probably since the Lumiere brothers somehow, but at least since the late 50s, there is this attention to various forms of modernity of cinema. And it happens that France, I hate to sound too nationalistic on this, but I think it is true that France has been especially caring for and paying attention to modern forms of cinema from everywhere all the way through. And it was obvious for us, just one of those who were in the position of accompanying these films. These are film festival programmers, these are art house distributors and art house exhibitors and film critics. All together, we would recognize Edward Young's film as a very significant and specific component of this modernity at large we care for. And probably this is a huge topic to address. It's a bit difficult in a little moment, but I believe there is a meeting point, which may be a illusionary meeting point, but which actually does work between Western modernity, let's say from Godard to Antonioni to Fassbinder, and Asian contemporary cinema, and especially Hu Xiaoqian and Edward Young, with all their specificities, they are really different. But both of them, we were more ready to watch their films in some respect than many people of the audience elsewhere, especially probably here in Taiwan, because we've been watching L'Aventura and we've been watching Breathless, and so we are open to disturbing formats, disturbing patterns in every respect, in terms of editing, in terms of framing, in terms of storytelling, in terms of defining what a character is, in terms of relation between sound and image, whatever, all the cinema language. We've been not only meeting them, relating with them, but we care for it, we love it. This is, to a large extent, what a lot of people expect, to discover more than to see again the same classical pattern, even if we also love classical cinema, which we do, but we expect cinema to enlarge its languages. And for us, this was part of this long movement, which never stopped, because we would discover films from Brazil in the later 60s and films from Eastern Europe, from, I don't know, Miklos Jancho or from Skolimowski, and then we would discover films, of course, Japanese new cinema. And so it was, in this way, for us, it was a new episode of a long story. And a long story we loved and we care for. So it was probably less brutal for us, the gap, than for audiences who had not been exposed to this long history of modernity, if modernity is the right word. It's another discussion we could have.
谢谢不动先生今天的分享，然后特别谈到的这个杨德昌作为电影导演跟漫画之间的关系。那我更好奇，现在在展场里面展出的扶贫电视作品，就你的立场，你怎么去看这个电视的作品，在杨德昌的这个电影创作的过程里，怎么样去定位这部作品？谢谢。
As I see it, it's a pre-Edward Young work, so to speak. Of course, now that we know what he would do afterwards, we would project on it what we would expect later. But honestly, as far as I can see, I really think Edward Young, the filmmaker, starts to become Edward Young as a filmmaker within expectation. It's important to see Floating Wheels because an artist's trajectory should be acknowledged as a whole. There's no dismissal of it, but as much as I can see it, for me it remains like the prehistory of Edward Young's vision or skills and capacities and arts as a filmmaker. Also, of course, it's part of a television program, even if he broke a lot of rules already in the television pattern for Floating Wheels. And also it is, well, one of the important things probably is to acknowledge the role of Sylvia Chang, who was important in the early part of his career and helped him a lot, and it is meaningful. But I really hope I'm supporting the best I can the project to have in France, hopefully, and elsewhere, if possible, a complete box set of DVDs of Edward Young's work, which I hope will and can happen. But and this should include Floating Wheels, but more like a bonus or something, more like a side element, considering the immense creativity we see in his feature films and the short film already, which is much more significant in expectation part. And also probably the last works, the in progress work about the wind, which hopefully could be shown, but also as a kind of bonus.
那扶贫的版权跟各位说非常非常贵，是用分钟来算。如果要有兴趣的话，我们下午再跟你讲多少钱。
谢谢否东教授的分享。我想请问一下，因为今天这个题目其实是非常有趣的，因为是十字路口。那刚才否东教授有谈到说，这个杨德昌对于城市的一些看法。那因为他的看法其实是不像我们看到有很多的电影，它是以nostalgia 就是怀旧去看待城市，也不是用一种拥抱着一个现代的发展。那像这样子的一个过渡的一个观点，就是说看待城市一切都在过渡的这样子的观点，来到可能30年后、23年后，或者是这么久以后，对于我们现代人在看待城市，或者是就像台北或者像法国。看待城市的观念有什么样子的继续的启发，或者是我们要怎么样子去让这件事情可以继续被看见
He was visionary about what was going on in the city of Taipei, and Taipei itself was visionary of what was coming in the developed world urban landscape. This is not to say that, I don't know, Paris or New York or London looks like Taipei, which is not the case, obviously. This is that through this urbanistic transformation, social relations are changing. And this is what we see. And of course, Confucian is an extreme, it's almost like a scholar on the blackboard, depiction of all the things that are broken, that are reshaped, that are displaced one from the other and become misunderstood or need to be re-put at the same level to be understood or to be shared by people who, most of them care for each other but don't know anymore how to relate because their map, which is a mental map, a sentimental map, a political map, a behavior map, much more than a building map and street map, are being displaced. And I think this is what he sees in the city of Taipei when he sees this huge building with glass and all the square windows, all the same. But also this, I was happy to have the help. I couldn't have done it by myself. I had the help of a Taiwanese friend who explained me the meaning of each neighborhood we see in Taipei story and how much it relates to a different part of the history of the country, the heritage, or what it is pointing to, what is still coming. And I still look for other filmmakers who have done such. I wrote a lot about cities. I wrote 2 books about cinema as city depiction, one about New York and one about part of Paris. And many directors, of course, have been dealing, and there is, we published a huge book like this in Cahiers du Cinéma about urbanism and cinema when I was there in the beginning of the 20s. 20,000. This is a very rich topic. In this field, I still see Edward Young's work as probably one of the most, the deepest way to address, not specifically actually about the architectural situation that we can see a lot actually in his film, but about what it means. What are the effects of these changes? Because these effects are worldwide, even if they take local forms, of course, related with traditions or heritage of the city.
好，如果没有的话，我自己有一个问题哦，因为我去年12月底的时候，我在巴黎就去找了FRODON先生，然后他有跟我提到说，即便杨德昌导演已经逝世很久，但他的影响力，其实在一些年轻一代的法国电影导演，其实有被显露出来。其实我那天还没有仔细追问他这个问题，我想说趁着机会可以请他多谈这个部分，延续刚刚陈老师从观众到电影导演看到杨德昌导演在他们身上的影响。
It was very striking for me that one of the best or more interesting and promising at the same time, but more than promising because now he's already one of the young, important French filmmaker. His name is Arthur Harari. He happens to be also the scriptwriter of the film who won the Palme d'Or in Cannes this year by his wife, Justine Triet. But he's the director of a very good film called Onoda. I'm not sure if it has been shown here. He called me. We didn't know each other at all, and he called me and he said, "Well, I've been asked, like we directors are, to show one of my favorite films, but instead of showing one of my favorite films, I decided to show a film I always wanted to see before, but I never managed to, which was A Brighter Summer Day." Then he discovered A Brighter Summer Day in this occasion, the screening with students, and then he says, "Well, this is the most beautiful film ever made. For me, this is just the absolute masterpiece. So I bought your book about it. Now I read a lot, and now I want to do more to help." And this, for me, this was very, because he is 30-something, Arthur Harari, and this was very striking because there is always the questioning that I was the more or less contemporary of Edward Young, like Olivier Assayas, and others, that this could have been only a generational attention and compatibility or even friendship, both with his films and with him. And then that new directors like Harari, but this is true with others. And the book, this book I wrote, which was published in French, was I discussed it with younger directors, or I discussed it also with I have to say film students in Paris, and more surprisingly for me, in Beijing, because I spent 4 days in Beijing Film Academy showing Edward Young's film to a packed auditorium of young mainland China film students who wanted also to learn about him. So I'm very confident that there is a lot of discoveries to be made by younger people who will see in his films even more than we've been able to see from in the time we saw them.
OK， 我们的刚刚的回答，我觉得已经为我们下午的那个座谈打开一些那个谈话的接口了，因为下午就会谈到遗赠或 legacy 的问题。好，那因为时间已经到了，回到我昨天讲的这个杨德昌法则，我们就要在这里终止，就不能多也不能少1秒讲哈，就是非常精准。好，那我们就谢谢FRODON先生很精彩的演讲。好，我们下午见，谢谢。